So welcome everyone to another Legal Tech Talk session. My name is Frances Anderson. I'm the MD of Net Law Media. Today, I am delighted to introduce another eye-opening session with a formidable panel from the legal and commercial world, where we're going to be focusing on under pressure, satisfying regulatory and client security demands. Now, today, I'm absolutely thrilled that we have Heather Anson, Managing Director of Anson Evaluate, joining us today, who will be leading it. Now, looking at this session, it's an interesting one in a time of a heightened risk landscape. We're going to be looking at gamified training to upskill partners, lawyers in a time of ever-increasing security risks. These are some of the actual steps that are being taken to increase the internal safeguards of firms, but how and what changes can be done to secure a firm's supply chain? When questions are asked from clients, what technical controls have you got in place to prevent breaches? And what happens if it's the client that gets breached? So we're going to be discussing this and much, much more. Now, before I go through and introduce you to the chair of today, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping. So now with Heather, if I start with her and then I'll do the housekeeping, I should say. Heather is the Managing Director of Anson Elevate. Now, she is a specialist regulatory compliance and training provider in the UK. So she delivers services through a variety of in-person training seminars, webinars, online e-learning courses and podcasts. Heather is also the editor and co-author of the GDPR Compliance Manual for Legal Practices. Prior to moving to the UK in 2011, Heather developed online education and training courses via her company, Professional Educational Portal, PEP, as well as running her law firm, Anson Law in Arizona, for the best part of a decade. The firm focused on providing highly specialist regulatory advice to corporate clients, acting in effect as in-house counsel. Clients include a wide range of corporates advising on regulatory matters across multiple jurisdictions, including Europe, China, Malaysia, and more. Now, Heather has continued to consult on multi-jurisdictional matters through niche law firm Digital Law UK and has now advised clients across North America, the European Union, Russia, and the Middle East. Now, looking at sort of the housekeeping, many of us have joined us here today before. So if you've got questions, please put up your hand. We'd love to have you join us, and Heather will bring you in. You can ask some questions to Heather or any of the panel members. Or if you prefer, you can put your questions through chat. Again, we'll be monitoring that all through the Q&A function below. Now, without further ado, Heather, I'm going to pass it over to you. And thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for that wonderful introduction. Bit long, but I will take it. I'm going to now introduce our panelists, who I don't have time to give such lengthy bios for, but are incredibly talented group of people. And you will hear in my intros the term experienced and knowledgeable and expert a lot. So I'll kick it off by introducing first Nathan Hayes, who's the IT director for Osborne Clarke. He's using his nearly 20 years of experience in transformative IT for the legal sector to currently help his firm manage risks and client expectations through European and Asian expansion. It's quite a big project at the moment. Karen Jacks, who is the Chief Technology Officer from Bird & Bird. She's highly experienced and successful leader of her firm's global technology team. She's also eager to share with us the knowledge and experience she's gained through her work. David Edwards, Head of Information Security for the Coventry Building Society. He's been awarded a Certified Master of Cybersecurity and Forensics from GCHQ. Was former head of the architecture and innovation for Weatherby's Private Bank. Obviously highly skilled and experienced, and we look forward to his contributions today as well. Carrie Bynan, partner of RDP Law, and also sits as a member of the Technology and Law Committee for the Law Society of England and Wales, as well as Cyber Wales. I got that right. And a regular speaker, both nationally and internationally, on her dual passions of data protection and cybersecurity. She understands the importance of law as it relates to technology. Now, and last but not least, we have Tony Pepper, who is the co-founder and CEO of a very recognizable software in the legal community, which is Egress Software Technologies. highly accomplished and recognized expert in IT, which includes being a certified BCS fellow. He has held numerous executive management positions in technology, and it's given him the wealth of knowledge on the issues we are discussing today. So with that, I'm going to now open our discussion. And before I do that, though, to let you know that any of you out there who are watching, if you want to ask a question, you can either type it into our Q&A box at the bottom, right over there, or you can hit the button that says raise your hand. And when I get a chance, I will call on you so that you can ask your question live. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about is the concept of legal data loss prevention, or DLP technologies. So DLP technologies, and we're going to talk about with a focus on process, procedures, and technologies, and what the modern threats are that we're now facing. And I'm going to ask Tony to start us off on this one, if you can.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. It's great to see you again. So I think one of the areas that certainly we see in this space, and it's not specific to law firms across the globe, it's really a challenge that firms in every industry really come across, which is around, especially in the world we live in now, where we are majority working from home or working remotely, often with distractions that are around us. The real challenge that the human element introduces when sharing content with our clients. And I think one of the observations certainly that we see in the market is that maybe solutions that were designed to tackle problems 4 or 5 years ago don't necessarily address some of the more complex problems that we find. And the first of those is really around human error. So if I'm in particular sharing content by email, which we know is a mission critical applications for all law firms, when they're sharing an email, and we've all done it, we've accidentally added the wrong recipient, and we've clicked send, and our friend within Outlook, the Outlook autocomplete, which is one of the sort of monsters behind that challenge, while it helps us to be productive, it certainly opens a risk. I think one of the things that we've seen is that many of the solutions in the market simply can't cater to solving that challenge. And one of the things that we're certainly keen to do is help educate customers that with these risks that have always existed to date, but ultimately there's new ways of solving these problems using the latest in technology. It's how we can educate firms to really get on the front foot and start embedding technology alongside education and procedure.
Right, and maybe at this point I can bring in Nathan, because one issue that I run across quite a bit, and I know you've discussed this before, is the issue of sort of responding to legacy technologies, and how do we deal with that when it comes to this challenge?
Okay, so yes, legacy technologies. I'm not quite entirely sure of the term legacy technologies.
Older tech. Sorry, that's my term. Right. Older tech, stuff that's been around a while, which in this world means 2 years, I think.
Yeah. So from my perspective, the threats are continually evolving, and the question is whether particular technologies evolve with it or not. And that's the principles around that are many in terms of whether that happens, and that's down to the vendor themselves. It's down to the technology being used, whether it is adaptable, and obviously there will come a point where it comes to the end of its life, and we need new technologies to replace those tools that we're using to help defend ourselves. But that's no different to the kind of the challenges we face around all of our tech stack. But I think to Tony's point, I would suggest he's suggesting that we're at sort of a bit of a crunch point. We've seen a material change in the threats, and yet those traditional, should we call them, technologies are not responding at the rate of change that we require in order to respond well to those new threats. And I think that's true. I think that we're having to source new technologies to be able to respond to those threats.
Okay, great. And Carrie, you would talk. You're from Wales, and obviously there are a lot of small practitioners there, solo or small practice firms there. And in this case, does size matter?
I, in terms of risk, I suppose it depends on the data that you hold. But in terms of what you can do about it, I think size would be relevant. If you have a larger law firm, they might be better resourced. They might be able to tap into more legal resources. Whereas if you're a sole practitioner or a very small firm, it's sometimes difficult to know where to turn for advice, because there's lots of opportunity to buy products. But what products do you buy? What risk are you trying to protect against? So it's understanding that whole piece. What's your threat? What's your risk? And where do you go for advice? So size does matter.
That's right. David, obviously you've got the infosecurity background. What can you give us some ideas of where we balance these risks and these technologies?
Sure. I think if you just step back for a minute and go back to your original point, which is, data. And there is a bit of a tension that's created between, how we use data and for what purpose. And as that's evolving, as technology is moving forward, so social media, just doing business on a day-to-day basis. And we take a lot of data sharing as granted on a basis of trust, just like this, what we're doing now. I think really when it comes down to technology, you're always going to have technology that's old because it's dependable and reliable, and we're always going to have technology that's new and exciting and trying to do new things. But one of the key challenges, I think, or what I face when it comes down to data is it's not so much data that's the problem. It's actually the person who's operating the data and their behavior. So traditionally, we would look at data as a pattern and say, well, I didn't expect you to look at credit card details. But maybe you do now because the business has changed. So they need to, especially with social media and way we share data, there's now more of a stronger emphasis on, is an individual's behavior different today than it was yesterday? And if it is that okay? And that's the sort of approach you've got to take, because we're not really going to be able to police everybody's mobile phone, browsing internet behaviors, and so on. So maybe it's more about behavior and people than it is really about the technology and the data.
Okay. And Karen, in your practice and in what you do with your team, how do you see this issue?
Gosh, there's been a lot on this one point. I think I'm just going to, if I may, draw all the way back to start with Tony, where he's talking about, the remote working that we've all been doing. I actually think that has lessened the problem slightly, because with, how people are traveling and they're just dashing stuff off on their phones. Well, they're not kind of doing that now, and we know they're not using their phones because we've all seen our data usage drop. So I actually think that problem is not exacerbated by the remote working, but nevertheless still a problem. I think the whole piece we're talking around the legacy traditional tech, and we had quite a discussion about this last week, is, what is legacy tech? I just think it is, we now know that the more traditional way of, let's even take virus scanning, you scan for a virus, what the virus footprint is, you can scan for it and stop it. Actually, that doesn't work anymore. It is now around looking at what is looking different and how users are acting differently. And so I think, we're seeing a lot more of the tech coming that is focusing on user behavior and different behaviors rather than I am actually seeking out this particular issue. And I think, Kerry, you talk around the size matters in firms, and I completely agree with that. However, there's the whole thing, the bigger the firm, it is a bit like an oil tanker, you try and change something that's a big way of swinging that round. And at the moment, there's so much tech out there that, even larger firms can't now see the wood for the trees. We look at all this tech and a lot of it overlaps, and you think you're going down a road here and then there's a new piece of tech coming along. And particularly in this space, that actually I think we're just challenged in a slightly different way as to, well, what do we choose? So of the 10 different monitoring systems that I can have, and you can kitchen sink it and buy everything, and then nothing that conflicts with that, and so on. So it is a big piece, and all of this is against the backdrop of wanting to be more open and more collaborative, and all these tools that enable you to collaborate with your clients and be more open and sharing everything. So we've got the backdrop of that, yet we're actually trying to secure more. So it is a big challenge, I think.
It is a huge one. Actually, I think maybe that leads us into our next main question, which is on how the legal industry is dealing with the software supply chain visibility challenges, and how they advise their clients is different than how they're advising their clients on, say, the more traditional supply chain issues. And Karen, did you want to start us off on this?
Yeah, so I think there's obviously us as suppliers to our clients, and then the suppliers that we've got, and so we've got both sides of that. So let's start as us as suppliers to our clients. The process for onboarding a new client is getting more and more onerous, because the clients have got more, they've got a lot more regulatory requirements, and you have to kick that down your supply chain. And we're now seeing, both with onboarding new clients and regular audits and even pitching and RFPs, that we're having to spend huge amounts of time looking at the InfoSec DLP piece. And each client wants something a bit different. And then you see their requirements. One's landed this week with an existing client of some years, and it's completely changed in 12 months as to their requirements. And the expectation is that we will have done all this, and we're looking, thinking, we haven't got this. We don't do that. So I don't know, we've got to, and it's very, very time consuming for us. And then you've got the other side of the coin, is what we expect of our supply chain, and the trust that we put in them, because we can have all the security in the world. If our supply chain, who are handling some of our data, don't, then that's a problem. So all the time we have to spend on the diligence down that chain, and that chain is having issues of its own. There's been some high profile incidents that kicks up and down and everywhere. So we're all scurrying around doing the same thing for both clients and suppliers, I think.
Right. And I know you mentioned the diligence, and I think this is a struggle for a lot of law firms, and maybe one of you can talk on this, is that, I'm an old lawyer and not an IT expert, even though I work in IT a lot. I can tell you that I've had to talk to lawyers, to solicitors on a regular basis, and say, don't worry that you don't know everything about technology. You don't have to be an expert in technology to do due diligence. Just as you would do for, say, a corporate merger. You don't have to know the ins and out of that company to be able to know how to do due diligence. So does anyone have some input on how we might help with the due diligence for firms who are looking at these types of technologies?
I think one good starting place might be the Law Society's guidance notes. So they do have some guidance notes on some things to ask. You could put alongside that the NCSC guidance notes as well. Depending on your size, if you're an SME, they have some really good guidance notes out there. Exercise in a Box, for example, which deals more with breach responses. But there's some good training and guidance notes that are freely available. That would be a good starting point.
Right. The ICO also has something in contracts.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
What you should be looking for in the contracts from your supply chain. I'm sorry, it was David?
Yeah, I was going to say, that's great advice. I think in the financial sector, this is an area which is quite heavily regulated. And as a result, especially from what the European Banking Authority has issued open guidance on how to manage suppliers, which is a great piece of reference. And some key standout parts to that regulation, which I draw attention to, which is understanding how you might want to exit from a supplier once you have that relationship established. Understanding what your indicators are with a supplier that might warrant you to think that supplier is not giving you the correct level of security, maybe resilience as such as well. And the other part, I think, what the regulation calls out, which is probably obvious but not top of mind, which is when you're working with any type of supplier, whether it's a software as a service, so you're buying a service from a website, or whether you're working with someone like Amazon, that it's actually all outsourcing. So we are delegating some element of responsibility, not necessarily accountability, to that supplier in terms of the due diligence. And great piece of reference, very thick document to read if you like reading, and you're obviously got nothing to do one evening. But it's a really great reference point, building on, of course, from the NCSC, which is a absolutely great reference.
Right. And I think, Nathan, if you could talk to sort of how it works, and you're working in a large firm that has a bit more time to look at maybe different suppliers and to deal with issues around, say, Office 365, which is a very popular thing, but may need a lot of tweaking to make it work in a compliant way. How would you say it compares, and what would you say about using the most popular versus using maybe something that's not as popular?
Well, before I get to that, I think the issue of the supply chain, for me, is the single biggest risk we face as a law firm in terms of cybersecurity risks. And due diligence obviously helps. That's going to help avoid getting into difficulty. But frankly, it's going to happen. So it's just much more importantly, obviously you've got to get that due diligence right, and that's great that there's some materials that we can rely upon to sort of follow best practice. That's really useful. But frankly, that's not going to stop it happening. So, and as we've seen, would any of us consider Microsoft or SolarWinds having not passed an appropriate due diligence process? I don't think so. So, and yet they've faced some of the most significant risks in the past few months of any organisation. So, and we're largely all, or certainly all, reliant on Microsoft, and I'm sure many of us are reliant on SolarWinds. So, it's all about how you respond. It's all about how you manage the breach when it happens, because it will happen, and one of your suppliers will run into this problem, because they are now the primary targets, because the threat actors are able to leverage their investment much better if they go after a sort of the holders of the keys, which these organizations are, much more so than we are as end users. So yeah, it's much more about putting in place an appropriate response and managing that risk. There is some suggestion that perhaps we should, and to your point, Heather, that we should perhaps be looking at using secondary providers on the basis that they're less likely to be targeted, and therefore we're less at risk. But equally, you could argue that those secondary providers simply don't have the same resources and same capability as the primary, and so therefore, whilst they may be less of a target, they're more of a risk for the simple reason they don't have the same degree of control. If you look at Microsoft, what Microsoft do around their 365 stack is astonishing. They have multiple teams, Red Hat teams, attacking their systems 24/7, and having a response team to be able to pick up on what basically their findings, pick up on their risks, and make the appropriate changes. That's $1 billion worth of investment every year just managing that, and how many organizations on the planet can do that? So I think it's a good argument to have, but ultimately we're all going to be reliant on these behemoth organizations as we move more and more into a cloud-based economy. So. Yeah, it's just prepare yourselves. I think that's the most important takeaway from all of this.
Outstanding. Tony, as somebody in the software development industry, can you help us with this?
Yeah, I mean, to Nathan's point, it's a real challenge, isn't it? And ultimately, the level of investment, the technology companies have to put in place now to ensure that they aren't ultimately the target that impacts their clients now is staggering, really. And I think ultimately, I think it's a joined up solution whereby many of that is with in-house resource of red teams, blue teams, constant monitoring. But I think it's also reaching out to organizations that also can help you along this journey, whether that is organizations like the Law Society, organizations like NCSC, to build a framework that allows any business, whether you're a software supplier like us or indeed a law firm providing services to your clients, to ultimately to try and tie down due process or actually diligence around the technology itself. And I think one of the things that I still find quite staggering is I'm still not convinced that the benchmark is still high enough within the software development industry to deliver software to customers. And I think to Nathan's point, you have to put Microsoft to one side and others that are being in the press, because you just know that there is appropriate level of investment there. But I think it's too easy for businesses to be able to spin up a really innovative service and then offer that to clients because it solves a real business problem, but ultimately then can catch a cold and are quite easily attacked ultimately. And so I think there does need to be a higher bar for not just the legal industry, but for all industries, about what a software supplier needs to be able to reach in order to provide critical services, specifically around data and privacy. And I don't think that bar's high enough.
Well, it's interesting. We have lawyers and legal professionals here, and I have this question because this is something I've been asked about for years. Is we have as legal professionals, and they have it in the medical field. We have a licensing and responsibility. We have an ethics board that we've got to license and respond to. Technology has become, and particularly cyber, has become such an important part of our daily lives. Do we need to look at, instead of just saying, okay, here's our baseline, here's what we should set up, that we actually create the same type of accreditation bodies and oversight, regulatory oversight of these companies, which would make the burden on organizations like law firms and their clients a bit less. Anyone?
I'll say, I think, the legal tech space is just ridiculous at the minute. We've rebranded tech that we've always had as legal tech, and then there's literally a new starter and a new joiner on the block every week. But exactly as you just said, Heather, when you get into some of these discussions, you've got lawyers seeing this stuff and going, oh, I'd love to use that, and we come along going, but it's really rubbish. They've kind of just spun up an AWS and they haven't thought about any of this stuff. And if we want, particularly if you're going to start using it to, do client transactions and with client data, this is just not going to cut it. And the conversations you then get with particularly the newer legal tech organizations, they just don't get it a lot of the time as how important this is. And it's not just us being, wheeling in our head of InfoSec to moan at them. This is an absolute issue. It's our reputational risk is just too much. So having some sort of regulatory body over there, I think would be great. But then likewise, we don't want to stifle people coming into this space. So it's a balance needed, but we're all doing exactly the same with these same providers, I suspect.
Right. And so if we have something like this, we can stop using the term that I have to do all the time. Just because it's a good piece of kit doesn't mean it's a compliant piece of kit. Mm. There's a big difference between the two. Mm. So unless we have any other comments or questions for this, I'd like to move on to the next aspect of this question, which is, as I think it was David that was saying, this is all a matter of when, not if. So these breaches happen. So what can a business do to best mitigate risks to supply chain breaches? And let's see, who would like to start on this one? How about Nathan?
Okay, so first of all is understanding who your suppliers are. Having a clear understanding. Secondly is have good contracting in place so that you have, for instance, breach notification clauses so that your suppliers are obliged to tell you there's been a breach if they know. it's pretty simple stuff. But actually, when when you've got hundreds of suppliers, it's tricky. And to Karen's point earlier about these very small suppliers, we are. It's a big problem for legal that we just have all these very small organisations. It's the reason why I've been asking the large legal tech providers, be it Thomson Reuters, LexisNexis, Intap, etc., is please just go and hoover all these organisations up and just give them some rigour, because we'd love to use some of their technology, but simply it's too problematic for us to do so. The risks of doing so totally outweigh any benefits. But yeah, so just making sure you know who your suppliers are, making sure your contract's in place with the relevant clauses, and then run some scenarios. Make sure that you have a breach response process in place, is actually run some scenarios, just as you do with your disaster recovery. Just run your processes to make sure that they're actually fit for purpose and people know how to respond. Because ultimately, what really matters here is our reputation as a law firm. That's the most important thing to us, and that reputation generates trust, and that is the lifeblood of our relationship with our clients. So that's what's got to be protected. If people are going to expect breaches to take place, what they want to know is how you respond. Do you let them know? Have you actually shared and been transparent, and done all the things to make your clients' lives as easy as possible? And if there's any hint that people are hiding things, then I think that's going to be a terrible outcome for any organisation that does that. And I think we've seen that with a number of organisations that have failed to manage these kinds of incidents properly. And yet in other cases, we've actually seen quite positive outcomes for organisations that have had a breach, but they've managed it so well that actually their stock, their reputation has actually improved. And that's quite an interesting outcome for something like this.
There's an interesting example with that I know from my past that has nothing to do with this, but it's somewhat related. Is when my father, who worked in PR for a gas company, says when something explodes, it's important to have good PR. It's the instinct to keep things private and keep things secret tends to backfire, as opposed to coming right out and saying, yeah, we did, you know what, we're here, we're doing something about it, and here's what you do. I like sites, I tend to use sites that have downtime monitors, so you can actually see what's going on, and they're actively telling you when they've had a breach. You don't have to wait to figure out what's going on. Carrie, do you have some ideas about this? I know data protection, there's always risk management in it, and this is one of your fields of expertise.
Absolutely, and I would just echo the comments really that Nathan has made. It all comes down to planning in advance, expecting the worst, planning for the worst, testing and evaluating, and training, and making sure that actually when something goes wrong, your lovely policy isn't just sat on a shelf. Actually, people know to put it into place. They know it's there. Who do they call? Data protection officer, hopefully. It's your training and it's your testing.
Right. And let's see, David. Audits are part of this, and other things with info security. What do you see?
So Nathan did a good job there, actually, of covering all those key parts. But I think a couple of things to consider, which is be prepared not to contract with a supplier. If that supplier is going to bring too much risk into your organization, just like anything we do, whether it's driving to work, which we don't get to do much at the minute, I must admit, but you're always going to take a bit of a gamble, and you're taking a gamble when you work with suppliers. So if they're not demonstrating that, they're going to be operating to the standards that you uphold in your business, then ultimately that's probably not a supplier that you might want to consider working with. And that's a really important aspect, because we often see things and we really appreciate the benefit, and then we're able to engineer ourselves into how helpful that will be in the business outcome. But actually, if they're not necessarily going to operate in our risk position, then that's probably not the supplier for us. I think building on again on the point Nathan said, which is when it comes to breach response, the real key elements there are having a great communication plan. understanding who, where, and how your business is going to come together to respond to that, and then simulating that. And ideally simulating that, not just with your IT teams, but also with your executive, your management and your wider business, so that they understand what their part is. Because in cybersecurity, when we lose data, it has gone, and we're not able to bring it back. And we're not able to bring the system back to an operational state like it would be if it's switched off. So once the event has happened, it's all about damage limitation at this point. And being slick at that, I think to your point, makes a massive difference in terms of the credibility, in terms of your organization, the fine, which you're likely to get from the Information Security Commissioner, and how ultimately you're going to continue to strengthen and build that trust with your customers, which ultimately you're, as a legal professional, I would suspect, are held quite highly as the benchmark of people looking after data. Right.
And Tony, if we can go to you, because you're usually on the receiving end, I think, in Ingress of a lot of these questions, and how do you perceive this from a risk mitigation?
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting to hear the panel, and I think they're absolutely right. I think what's been covered is the kind of the understanding the landscape that you're operating in and being able to adequately respond to an incident when it happens. But as a technologist, I just naturally err on the side of prevention. So from my perspective, I look at it of naturally with policy and procedure, but where does technology fit into this equation that can prevent a breach of security, rather than having to clear it up. But when you look at that, it's a bit of a minefield. But I think there are areas that you can go, and I think the ICO is the most logical place to go, where you can look at, well, what are the most common causes of breaches of security? Because again, we can talk all day about understanding our supply chain, order them, having them under the right contract, being able to architect when a problem goes wrong. But the reality is, what are the most common breaches of security, and where can I best mitigate it from happening in the first place? And I thought it was interesting at the top of the call. There's one theme that always comes out, and it's the human layer, isn't it? It's people. And it's exactly what Karen said. It's about them behaving differently, and that could even be because someone's approached them and is through a phishing campaign is trying to pretend that there's someone they're not, or it's that someone's making a genuine mistake. So I think sometimes you've got to look at, well, where do I, on the 100 breaches that could take place, where's the lion's share of the problem going to come from, and how can I put technical controls in place to maybe eliminate 70 or 80% of those? And they are sadly largely people orientated. And they're also usually directly linked to email. And whether it's a phishing attack, whether it's I've sent a wrong file to the wrong client, or whether I've added the wrong recipient, all of those are predominantly using email as the threat vector to fundamentally attack a firm. It's become, while it's a business tool we all rely on, it is the biggest risk for every business as a mechanism to attack the business. So I think I look at it as how do we reduce the risk, and then once you can never eliminate the risk of that, there's absolutely no doubt. And then if you can eliminate it to 5%, then it's those challenges where you can get on the front foot with the right comms plan, the right organization to respond. Because if you're completely open, and I don't think it's necessary to be completely open in this modern landscape, then I think it's you're onto hiding to nothing really.
And actually, that brings me to a point that maybe Carrie can answer to, which is that sometimes we try not to use email for a lot of our communications with our clients. We use a client portal, secure portal-to-portal encryption, all of that. But some clients are like, I don't want to use that. I want to use. We had one yesterday who says, I've put this on Google Drive for you, and we're like, no. So how do you deal with when a client says, but I want to use that?
I think. Oh, sorry. Karen, do you want to answer? Or?
Carrie.
It's me. That's you see the.
Sorry, I was thinking of Carrie, not Karen.
Oh, right. Sorry.
Sorry. We'll come to you next because it's.
I think in terms of It comes down to our regulatory obligations actually first, doesn't it? So we have two things as lawyers, your confidentiality and also your data protection obligations, as well as all your contractual obligations and things. So what are we expected to do? Well, we're expected to document our policies and procedures, aren't we? So hopefully there's a policy in place that says you don't install any tech on any of your computer or tech without permission from someone who actually knows what they're doing. So hopefully that is in place, and hopefully people follow it. I think that's the best thing. Prevention as well as a bit of cure, hopefully. Anyway, Karen.
Yeah, completely. And I think, Tony, you said, you can't eliminate everything with tech. You can up to a certain bit. The only way that you will eliminate this is not let your users do anything. And that is not life, is it? Because we're running a business. So, and users don't want to be bothered by any of this. They just want to come in, do the job, and not go home, go back downstairs or whatever in this remote working way. But so I think you can put tech, you've got levels. You can have the tech that the user doesn't even know is there, that is checking what's being done where, checking user behavior, checking all the threats. You get your SOC externally checking, you do your pen testing, all of that, great. And then you've got the tech that people do have to engage with, and that is when it starts getting a little more challenging. And you can still have all of that. It's the one click in the one email.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Well, and I think the thing you, as a technologist, would say is that you want to make that interaction as frictionless as possible. And I think that's important when we're trying to get our clients off something that may be not compliant, but a really cool piece of kit, onto something new. We have to try and make that as a smooth a transition as possible. The last question on this, unless we have any questions from our audience, would be around one of the things that I think too many companies and firms rely on is insurance. So how can insurance play a role in mitigation of risks in a good way or a bad way? And whoever would like to chime in on this.
Did anyone see the NCSC's, or listen rather, to the NCSC's event yesterday? They had an event on insurance, and it was really interesting what they were saying, because obviously insurance has a place. The reasons why you buy it might be different, but some of the benefits are actually the breach response. So I suppose it depends on what does the policy offer you, not just paying out if you have third-party claims against you, or helping you get your data back, but actually how do they help you, within what time frame, what expertise do you have access to? So yeah, it's a really interesting debate about insurance.
Yeah, I think the two aspects of that are, one, making sure that if you're going to get insurance, make sure you get the right insurance and read it, but also don't expect it to pay out what you just do that instead of nothing else. I've known people who've said, "Oh, I've got this cyber insurance, I don't have to worry about it," because that's not enough. It's just one piece of that puzzle.
There's probably a condition in the insurance requiring you actually to have appropriate technical measures in place. So
exactly.
Yeah, but is that not part of the problem? What's appropriate?
Yeah.
Because what again, you can have all your policies, all your tech, all your thing, and you'll go, well, I think this is appropriate, but it's a very subjective discussion there as to what is appropriate. I mean, I personally wouldn't think, oh, we've got cyber insurance, that's all fine. I just see that as, well, if ever we have a big problem, then I might get some of the money back. I'm still going to have the big problem. And the biggest, no insurance will help you of that reputational risk. A client doesn't care whether you've got insurance or not. They've just seen that you have had a breach. And that.
I think if you want more interesting reading, you see what, if you want to read the case, the test case that they did at the Supreme Court for the insurance on hospitality industries during COVID and whether they had to cover something. And it was 50 some odd pages of how the insurance company was going to get out of having to pay on business interruption insurance. And it worked. So yeah, we generally have to be really careful what kind of insurance we have and how we implement it.
I've got some observations on cyber insurance. It's a different type of policy that you might find in your organization because it comes in sort of two parts. part one is your traditional paying out, recovery of losses, and so on. But there's actually a completely separate part to this insurance, which is enabling you to respond better. So it will have panel in there. So for example, it might have specialist legal advisors on data protection that you can call in. It will have essentially the ability to set up call centers and take over that management of your customers for you in order to manage that data breach communication. And it will also have a set of panelists that are there to come in and help you investigate and stabilize and do the IT elements of the overall part of it. So when you're renewing your insurance, the insurance providers clearly don't want you to have to call on that element of insurance policy, but they're also keen to offer you new services. So for example, it's not uncommon for your insurance provider, if you read the details, to offer you some element of breach assessment to enable you to do playbooks with your executives and simulate it from that perspective. And also, we've touched on suppliers. Some of the insurance policies will also give you services to give you a risk assessment of your suppliers, to give you an understanding how much of a risk they are to your overall security posture. So within security policy, in security insurance, it's well worth sitting down with your broker and really understanding what you get.
Yeah. Okay, we have another topic to move on from, which is one that's close to my heart, which is assessing assessing the safeguards that you have in place and ensuring that lawyers practice what they preach. And considering a lot of my clients are law firms and lawyers, and getting them to do that is great. But I'm going to go to Nathan first, because you used a term that I love to implement in my data protection training, which is gamification.
Yeah, so one of the things that we're doing, to Tony's point about email being one of our primary risks, risk factors. So we measure through pseudo phishing attacks. We measure our people's susceptibility to falling foul of phishing attacks. And what we do is we publish that information. And because we're a Swiss Verein, so we have multiple partnerships across the world, we publish that information as a mechanism of gamification for, or is it peer pressure? I'm not sure, one or t'other, to encourage the different businesses to engage more so with the phishing or cyber training in order to improve their stats if they're at the bottom of that league table. And we're finding that's actually facilitated a really good response from people as they recognize them. Nobody wants to be at the bottom of the table, right? So it's a good way to get them to engage. And we're doing that every month, so people are getting a constant reminder of just how good or bad they are as an organization at spotting phishing attacks. And by the way, the overall results have been greatly improved to where we started in the benchmark we started with, which I won't share with you here.
We use some gamification really well in a data mapping exercise in a very old firm that had a load of information. It was by department. They were, how many boxes could they get through and filed and tracked in a week, as they were having to go through tons of them. So that was one way to make a very difficult task fun. Karen.
Yeah, we haven't quite done that, but I think I'm going to steal that idea from Nathan and take that in on the view that lawyers are generally very competitive. I think things are easier now in education internally on this topic, because there are so many high-profile cyber issues now that you can't help but understand that this is a problem that affects all of us. And I think because it's so there's so much in our personal lives as well as our professional lives now. So generally, a few years ago when we did ISO, it was generally met with, oh, this is just too painful, and why do I need to do this? Whereas now I think people have accepted this is just part of your professional obligation, is to protect ourselves and our data and our clients' data, and therefore there are certain things that we will need to do that you will find a bit painful. But generally people are more interested in it. And we've tried all sorts of things. You know, we do a lot more on sort of video with avatars that look like our infosec people and make short and snappy. And, you know, we have, you know, we do have acceptable use policy, which is, we've tried to make it a bit less dry for people to read. And in there are, you know, some, not threats, but, you know, implications of, not if you make a mistake, because people make mistakes, but if you go against what was put in place, there could be, you know, implications, but we've never actually carried that through with anyone. So it is slightly easier, but it's a constant thing. You've got to be continually doing it. You've got to be doing your phishing campaign. You've got to be doing your education. You've just got to do it lots of different ways, I think, to get into the hearts and minds of people.
Yeah. And Tony, you've talked a lot in this about sort of the human aspect of this. You can build all the technology you want, the human aspect. So from your side, what do you think?
Well, I just love this whole conversation, really, because it's so different to the conversation that was 10 years ago. Because technologists 10 years ago was, let's just keep people out of it. People are stupid; they won't understand it. Let the technology fraternity deal with it at the boundary, and actually don't even let end users in business know that we're protecting them. And that's just so far removed from where we are right now. I think where we are, it's the polar opposite to that. It's about using gamification to make it fun, to educate and engage with end users. It's like what Karen was saying about, don't have tech that's hard to use. Let's be really uber focused around end user experience and make it really productive. And I'll tell you why, and that's because we're all in just a competitive environment now. And if I work at this law firm that has really outdated tech and it's really hard to survive and do my job in this firm, guess what? I'm just going to go to the firm down the road because they've got a different way and a more enjoyable way of me working. So I think there's a real positive approach now of shifting the whole engagement model to people in business and saying, look, you are part of the solution. We are going to educate you on what the threats are. We are going to ask you to feed into the advice and the guidance that we give you. And guess what? You are accountable, just like InfoSec's accountable. The accountability around privacy is no longer a privacy, InfoSec, data security issue. It's everyone's issue that we all need to take ownership over. And I think that's a really, really positive step. And I think technology vendors are heading that direction. I think overall strategy across the business is heading that direction. So I think it's incredibly positive.
And I think the more training we have out there, the better it gets. Because from experience, I can say I used to have a very popular CLE or CPD in Arizona. They teach on tax law. Believe it or not, I love teaching tax law, but it was very popular and full every year because I used poker chips and I gave out prizes. And it was engaging and people can learn. But I think, Carrie, you and I are on the same page a lot in terms of data protection and compliance and stuff by creating a culture. So can you tell me a bit about that? You gotta unmute yourself first, though, hon.
Oh no, unmute. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Culture is really important. Culture in identifying or being able to speak up if you've done something wrong. Don't hide it under the carpet. Culture in being able to challenge something. We do it this way. Why do we do it this way? Perhaps there's a better or different way of doing it. So yeah, and again, it all circles back, as everyone said, to people, training, culture. It's all part of the big picture.
Absolutely. Yeah. And David, your wise words on this.
Yeah. So when it comes to cyber education and bringing it to life, we actually looked in the media and we brought journalists in to work with us to understand a key part of it is building the right messaging. So, we're all familiar with, COVID and the messaging around COVID and, stay at home or whatever it is. So we realized that actually you can build really key messaging and be really inclusive in terms of campaigning as opposed to a program that resonates with people that then becomes at the top of mind. Now, we do underpin that with other activities. So, for example, we profiled our executive social media and then replayed back to them what their social media presence actually enabled criminals to do should they stumble across it. And we call it security fitness. So all organizations should have a security fitness program, which you have to continually work at to remain security fit. And we've got escape rooms, all sorts of things that we do on a regular basis, podcasts. We invite people in who are not part of InfoSec, who maybe have been part of a cyber response, and we interview them how it made them feel emotionally, and what it was like to be at the center of a response, and what it really meant. And we have people dedicated, employed in our organization who actually do this as a full-time job to make sure that we continually push out that information and make it engaging.
Great. Okay, before we finish up, I want to give everyone on our panel one last chance to talk. And I'll go in clockwise order, starting with Carrie and ending down with Tony. And what I'd like you to give us is just a short 30-second, either your most important thought on this topic or the answer to the question that we haven't asked yet.
So most important thought, I think, would be to not be afraid to ask for help and reach out to other organizations. And there's a lot of great information out there. And possibly the topic we haven't talked about yet, but would be really good to talk about, would actually be the qualification process of lawyers. Where does cyber, where does tech sit into that? Because we are, with some of the law schools, seeing them building in coding for lawyers. Should we be putting more emphasis on cybersecurity outside of the regulatory perspective, more of a tech focus?
Excellent. Karen?
I guess that is just what I think we've all agreed. It's not if, it's when, and to make sure prepared for that. And, to make sure that your risk committees, your board, your exec committee, your management of your firms, however it might be structured, are really aware of the risk is always there. I might spend all this here, but you'll never be 100% free of this as a risk.
Great. And David?
So I think my sort of key takeaway for people would be cybersecurity is actually about your own personal safety. Whether you're at home, at work, browsing the internet, you've got a family that's looking on the internet, whether you're putting a cash card in a cash machine. And if you look at it, that it's about your personal safety, that when you're at work, it's everybody's responsibility to keep an organization safe, not just your security department, or a bit more of a fire brigade when things are going wrong. From that viewpoint, summarizing that on sort of key topics today, I think that, that relationship with suppliers is massively key. Absolutely. The more you have, the more risk you take, and the more resilient your business is dependable on them suppliers working really well. And I was trying to think, Kerry, about what question didn't we ask from that perspective. And I couldn't really think of one because I think you've covered absolutely everything in a short period of time. So I'll leave it there.
Great. How about you, Nathan?
So unfortunately, you've got to be comprehensive. And depending on your organization, that varies in terms of the extent to which you attend to each of the areas we've talked about. We've talked about training, we've talked about supplier management, we've talked about technology, process, scenario planning, etc. You do have to attend to every area. You can't avoid any single one. If you do, that's the one that will bite you. So being comprehensive is really important. But the only way you can do that, and depending on each organization, you have to keep it simple. And what simple means will vary. Large organizations will get more complex, because disappearing down a rabbit hole will mean that you will avoid and you will miss one of those areas. You'll get the balance wrong.
Excellent. And now last word goes to Tony. Well, actually it goes to me, but Tony, second to last.
So mine's always going to be from a tech perspective, isn't it, Heather? So I think if you deliver technology to people in your firm that's difficult to use or gets in the way, they're going to do anything they can to avoid using it and work around it. And we've seen that for forever, really. So I think from our perspective, I look at it as, how do we deliver to our people in firms something that actually makes them more productive and is actually intelligent in its approach. So, and I think because of just the huge advances in machine learning and AI particularly over the past 5 years, actually, but probably slightly more than that, I think the new tech stack all has intelligence at its core, rather than maybe slightly older ways of working, which allows a completely different experience to make sure that security doesn't get in the way, but it is a safety net to prevent a genuine mistake, or maybe someone trying to pretend that there's someone they're not, without reducing that productivity.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And on that, I want to thank the panel so much, because we have fit a ton in, and having such expertise in front of us is fantastic. And thank you, everyone who's joined and participated today. And those of you who are listening afterwards, thank you too. I do want to confirm, and we're very happy to confirm, that the next session will be for Global Legal Tech Talks, on the 31st of March at 8 a.m. British Standard Time. And it will be on leading digital disruption in the agile world. Session is, of course, chaired by the preeminent and endorsed by preeminent Professor Richard Susskind, OBE. And they'll have high caliber leaders in in-house professional services and private practice legal communities. And also don't forget to subscribe today, because then you'll get access to all of these great discussions. And if there's anything else, Francis will cover it. Otherwise, have a great day.